Chapter 9. The Giant Elf. Time seemed to stand still, and no matter how hard she tried, Crysta could not fly away from the Hexxus tree or break the spell that held her to it. Then she heard the voice. It came from somewhere deep inside the tree, and although it was muffled, she heard it quite plainly. The sound of it made her wings curl.
When the forest fails,
It growled.
then I'll be free to seek the revenge that's due to me.
The earth grumbled, and the trees shuddered violently. Then, just as suddenly, the forest became deadly quiet again. Crysta fluttered her wings and shot forward, suddenly free of the spell. Her heart thumping, she looked around, but not a leaf stirred. There wasn't even a ripple on the surface of the creek. It had all happened so quickly that she wondered if she imagined the whole thing. She was about to fly back the way she'd come, when the biggest elf she'd ever seen walked out of the forest towards her. He was a giant of a figure, and very heavy-footed. He was dressed differently to anyone Crysta had ever seen. His clothes didn't look like they'd been made from flowers or leaves or spider webbing. His huge feet were covered, and she couldn't imagine what they looked like. His arms and hands were bare, and his fair hair stuck out from under his shiny nut-like hat. Music seemed to be coming out of his ears, and he was humming to himself. On a white belt around his waist was what looked like a yellow pouch. Crysta noticed that, like Wokia, this giant elf didn't have wings. But apart from his size, she didn't think he looked dangerous. In fact, she thought he looked very happy. She said, "Hello," but he didn't hear her. And when he walked straight past her, she knew he couldn't see her either. The giant elf walked up to the Hexxus tree. He stopped and examined the loose black bark. Crysta saw a frightened little bug scurry across the bark, and watched the elf raise his hand and squirt the bug with a bright red liquid. The bug turned red as it rushed for safety. Then, something very unusual happened. When the red liquid touched the tree, it started to hiss and bubble and boil. The giant elf gasped and stepped back onto a mossy rock, overbalanced and landed in the creek. Crysta couldn't help laughing at him as he floundered about in the water like a long-nosed wombat, until she realized he was trying to save his yellow pouch, which had come off his belt and was floating away.
Oh, man!
Unable to help him, she circled his head and discovered that when she flew in front of his face, he noticed her. He squinted and reached out to grab her. He was so off the mark, she could only laugh. She laughed at the way his eyes crossed when he tried to grab her. She wasn't the least bit afraid of him, for she knew she could outdistance him in the twinkling of an eye. Engrossed by this game, she didn't pay attention to the approaching grumble until it became a loud roar. Riveted to the spot, she looked over her shoulder and glimpsed what looked like an enormous monster charging at the trees. She screamed as everything went black. She felt herself suffocating and knew that she'd been caught in the giant elf's hands. Then the darkness disappeared when the giant elf opened his hands, and she saw the Hexxus tree swaying behind them.
Look out!
She screamed as the gnarled tree toppled towards them, but the elf couldn't see what was happening, and he couldn't hear her. There was only one thing she could do. Closing her eyes, she held out her arms and chanted frantically,
Bless your eyes with magic light, I give the gift of fairy size. Oh.
A burst of glowing energy shot out of her hands and she felt herself falling through the air in a flurry of leaves. The falling tree crashed around her. When she opened her eyes, she was amazed to see the unconscious elf stretched out beside her. Only now, she was her size.
Oh no! I shrunk him!
She gasped. The tree continued to shake as another tremendous roar filled the air. Caught up in the branches, they were being dragged towards the roaring monster. Overwhelmed by a sense of powerlessness, she tried desperately to revive the elf, but the elf could not be moved. The roar was so deafening that Crysta knew that whatever it was about to eat them. Then a dark shadow engulfed them and lifted them up. Crysta screamed. "Don't go," I said. "Bad idea," I said. "But would you listen? Oh no, oh no, oh no."
Batty!
Cried Crysta, unable to believe her ears. "Warped banana corpses, fairy bug! You must never fly out of FernGully again!" Heading back over the plain of Xanthoreus, Crysta thought Batty's crazy chatter was the most wonderful sound she'd ever heard. Once they were across the plain, Batty slowed down, and for the first time, looked closely at the unconscious elf. "It's a human! It's a human!" He shrieked, crashing into a tree, and hurling Crysta and the human into the branches.
Oh wow! A human!
Crysta whispered. She inspected the limp, almost lifeless body beside her. He was breathing, but he didn't respond to her touch, not even when she bent over him and brushed his fair hair away from his eyes. She noticed a slender, shiny object like a silver leaf sticking out of his belt. She pulled it out and examined it closely. At this moment, the human stirred and opened his eyes. First thing he saw was his knife pointed dangerously close to his face. "Take anything you want," he blurted out. "I won't tell the cops."
Are you alright?
She asked, waving the knife under his nose. "I'm fine, I guess," he nodded, eyeing her nervously. "Tell me, what's going on here?"
Monster, I tried to eat you. Monster, my friend and I saved you.
She smiled. Then, without another word, she disappeared up the tree to look for Batty. She found him lying in a fork of the tree with a stunned expression on his face. "Sonic interference, what a nightmare! I thought I saw a human!" Hanging over the branch, he looked below him. He shrieked, "I did!" "Is he really a human?" Crysta asked, buzzing with excitement. "Yes," Batty jabbered. "Restrain it! Medicate it! Kill it! Kill it!"